There is a question that has a way of surfacing in the quieter moments of life. Not the loud moments, not the moments of urgency or decision, but the gentle ones, the ones where the usual noise of the day has thinned out and something more reflective is possible. It is a question that sounds, on first hearing, almost too strange to be taken seriously, and yet it is one of the oldest and most carefully examined questions in the whole of philosophy. The question is this: is what we call reality actually real? Or, to put it another way, when we look at the world around us, when we feel the ground beneath us and the air on our skin and see the colors of things and hear the sounds they make, are we experiencing something that is genuinely there, independent of us, solid and self-sustaining, or are we experiencing something more like a construction, a representation, a kind of vast and seamless picture that stands between us and whatever truly lies behind it? This question has been explored with great seriousness and great subtlety by some of the finest minds in the history of human thought. It is not a question that belongs only to eccentrics or mystics, though mystics have certainly engaged with it. It is a question that has occupied Plato, Descartes, Kant, and a long lineage of careful thinkers up to the present day, including contemporary physicists and philosophers of mind who approach it with tools and arguments that would have been unimaginable to the ancient Greeks. And it is a question that, when approached slowly and without urgency, opens out into some of the most interesting intellectual territory available to us. The place to begin is with experience itself, with the simple fact of what it is like to be in the world. Right now, there is presumably a great deal of sensory information available. There are surfaces and textures. There is the quality of light in the room or the darkness of it. There are sounds near and far. There are the subtle, ongoing sensations of a body existing in space. Weight, warmth, the faint pulse of blood. All of this feels very immediate. It feels like direct contact with the world. We do not usually experience our perceptions as intermediaries between ourselves and reality. We experience them as reality itself, or as very thin and transparent windows onto it. But consider for a moment what is actually happening when we perceive something. When we see an object, say, a cup on a table, light is reflecting off the surface of the cup and entering the eye, where it is focused onto the retina and converted into electrical signals that travel along the optic nerve into the visual cortex at the back of the brain. The brain then processes these signals through an extraordinarily complex sequence of operations, and the result of all this processing is a conscious experience. The appearance of a cup sitting on a table at a certain distance with a certain color and shape. What we experience is not the cup directly. What we experience is a kind of neural reconstruction of the cup, a model that the brain has built from the information available to it. This observation does not immediately mean that the cup is not real, or that our experience of it is an illusion in any troubling sense. But it does mean that our contact with the world is more mediated than it naively feels. There is always a layer of processing, a layer of interpretation between the thing and our experience of the thing. And once we notice this, a certain question becomes very natural. How much does that layer of processing shape what we experience? How faithfully does our internal model of the world correspond to the world as it actually is? And is there even a way to check? These questions have been with philosophy from very early on. In ancient Greece, there was a group of thinkers called the sophists who were quite happy to conclude that there was no firm ground of truth. That perception was relative to the perceiver, and that whatever seemed true to a person was for that person true. The philosopher Protagoras is associated with the idea that man is the measure of all things, meaning that there is no reality beyond what appears to each individual. This is a form of what philosophers call relativism, and it is one of the earliest and most provocative responses to the unreliability of perception. But it was Plato who gave the question its most enduring and vivid philosophical form. Plato, who lived in Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, was a student of Socrates and one of the most influential thinkers in the entire history of Western philosophy. He was convinced that the world we perceive through our senses is not the most real world, that behind or above the world of appearances there is a deeper, truer reality, and that our ordinary perception gives us access only to a kind of copy or shadow of that deeper reality. His most famous illustration of this idea is the allegory of the cave, which appears in his dialogue, The Republic. Plato asks us to imagine a group of people who have been chained inside a cave since birth. They are positioned so that they can only see the wall in front of them. Behind them, there is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners, people walk past carrying objects. The fire casts shadows of these objects onto the cave wall, and these shadows are all that the prisoners have ever seen. For them, the shadows are the world. They have no conception of the objects casting the shadows, let alone of the fire, let alone of the sunlit world outside the cave. Now imagine that one of the prisoners is freed. He turns around and is dazzled by the fire. It hurts his eyes, having only ever seen shadows. He is dragged, reluctantly, out of the cave and into the open air, and there the sunlight is so intense that he can barely see at all. Gradually, his eyes adjust. He begins to see things as they actually are, the real objects, the real landscape, and eventually the sun itself, the source of all light and visibility. He understands now that the shadows he took for reality were only shadows, only pale impressions of things far richer and more real than anything he had encountered in the cave. The allegory is rich with layers of meaning, but at its core, it is saying something about the relationship between appearance and reality. The cave represents the world of sensory experience, the world of everyday perception. The shadows represent the objects of that perception, the things we take to be most real, most immediately given. The sunlit world outside the cave represents what Plato called the realm of forms, the world of abstract, perfect, eternal ideas of which physical things are imperfect copies. The form of beauty, for instance, is the perfect and unchanging idea of beauty, of which all beautiful things are partial and imperfect instances. The form of the good is the highest and most fundamental of all, the source of reality and truth in the way that the sun is the source of light and visibility. For Plato, mathematics was the key to understanding the relationship between the two realms. When a geometer draws a triangle on a piece of paper and reasons about its properties, the geometer is not ultimately reasoning about that particular drawing, which is imperfect, approximate, bound to fade or be erased. The geometer is reasoning about the ideal triangle, the form of triangle, which has no physical location, does not change over time, and is perfectly and exactly what it is. Mathematical truths are eternal and necessary, and their objects, numbers, shapes, relations, are more real, in Plato's view, than any physical thing. Physical things participate imperfectly in the forms, but are not themselves fully real in the way the forms are real. There is something about this picture that remains deeply compelling, even now, more than 2,000 years after Plato articulated it. The world of physical things is genuinely impermanent. Things come into being and pass away, change and decay, shift and dissolve. The world of mathematical truths, by contrast, seems to be one of perfect stability. 2 plus 2 will always equal 4. The relationship between the sides of a right triangle will always be what it is. These truths do not depend on any particular physical embodiment. They seem, in some sense, more solid and more lasting than the physical world itself. And yet, the Platonic picture raises its own deep questions. If the forms are the truly real things, and physical things are only their imperfect shadows, then what is the relationship between the two realms? How does the physical world manage to participate in the forms? And how do we, who are physical beings embedded in the physical world, manage to access the forms? To do mathematics, to recognize beauty, to understand the good. Plato's answer involved the idea of recollection, the thought that the soul, before entering the body, dwelt in the realm of forms and had direct knowledge of them. The experience of learning, for Plato, was really the experience of remembering what the soul already knew. This is why philosophical education, for Plato, was not so much the acquisition of new information as the awakening of something already present, the drawing out of knowledge that was always there, waiting to be recovered. This idea of the soul's pre-existence and its prior knowledge of the forms is not one that most modern readers will find easy to accept as literal doctrine, but the philosophical intuition behind it, the idea that some of our knowledge is not simply derived from sensory experience, that the mind has its own resources, its own structures that it brings to experience, rather than simply receiving from experience. This intuition is very much alive in modern philosophy and cognitive science, though expressed in quite different terms. The question of what the mind brings to experience and what experience brings to the mind is one of the deepest in all of philosophy. And it connects directly to the question of whether reality is what it appears to be. Because if the mind is actively shaping what we experience, if it is not a passive receiver, but an active constructor, then the relationship between experience and reality becomes considerably more complex and interesting than naive common sense suggests. The philosopher who brought this question to perhaps its sharpest and most systematic focus was René Descartes, the 17th century French mathematician and philosopher who is often described as the father of modern philosophy. Descartes was a man of remarkable intellectual ambition. He wanted to place human knowledge on a completely secure foundation, to find, beneath all the uncertain and shifting terrain of ordinary belief and opinion, something absolutely solid, something that could not possibly be doubted, and on which all genuine knowledge could be built. His method for finding this foundation was radical. He decided to doubt everything he could possibly doubt, to subject all his beliefs to the most rigorous, skeptical scrutiny possible, and to see what, if anything, survived. This is known in philosophy as the method of doubt, and the account he gives of it in his Meditations on First Philosophy, published in 1641, is one of the most elegant and influential pieces of philosophical writing ever produced. Descartes begins by noticing that the senses are unreliable. We have all had the experience of perceiving something and being wrong. Objects look different depending on the conditions of viewing. A stick looks bent when partially submerged in water. Colors look different in different lights. Distances are misjudged. The senses, it seems, can deceive us. And if the senses can deceive us sometimes, how can we be certain they are not deceiving us all the time? This is where the argument begins to deepen. Descartes considers the possibility of a dream. When we dream, our experience is typically vivid and convincing while it is happening. We do not usually realize we are dreaming until we wake up. In the dream world seems real. We move through it. We interact with people in it. We feel emotions appropriate to what is happening in it. And yet, when we wake, we recognize that it was not real, that it was a construction of the sleeping mind, rather than a genuine encounter with an external world. Now, Descartes asks, how do we know that we are not dreaming right now? Is there a test we can apply while we are apparently awake that would definitively distinguish genuine waking experience from a very vivid and convincing dream? This is an uncomfortable question, and it is worth sitting with it for a moment rather than rushing past it. Most of the usual answers, I can pinch myself, I can check the calendar, I can look for signs of strangeness that typically accompany dreams, are not fully satisfying because all of these tests are performed within the experience whose reality is in question. If the entire experience is a dream, then the pinch and the calendar and the apparent absence of strangeness are also part of the dream, and they give no genuine evidence of waking. The test is conducted with the very instruments whose reliability is in doubt. Descartes takes the argument one step further into what has become one of the most famous thought experiments in the history of philosophy. He invites us to consider the possibility of an evil deceiver, a being of vast power and intelligence who has made it his purpose to deceive Descartes as thoroughly as possible. This evil genius, as he is sometimes called, controls all of Descartes' experience and has arranged it in such a way that everything Descartes believes about the world is false. The objects he seems to see, the people he seems to meet, the mathematical truths he seems to know, all of it is a fabrication, an elaborate illusion, constructed by the deceiver. Now, could this be true? Descartes' point is not that he believes it is true, but that he cannot, with absolute certainty, rule it out. There is no way, from within his experience, to prove definitively that his experience is not the product of a malicious deceiver. And if he cannot rule it out, then the method of doubt requires him to treat it as a live possibility and to withhold belief from everything that could, in principle, be false under such a scenario. This is a very powerful form of skepticism. Under the evil genius hypothesis, even mathematics might be doubtful, not because the mathematical arguments themselves are flawed, but because the evil genius might be making him see apparently valid arguments where there are none, making him feel the certainty of conclusions that are in fact false. Everything that depends on experience, everything that depends on the senses, everything that depends on memory or reasoning, all of it is, in principle, vulnerable to the evil genius's deception. Is there anything that survives? Descartes famously finds that there is. Even if everything he experiences is an illusion, even if an evil genius is deceiving him at every turn, there is one thing that cannot be doubted: the fact that he is thinking. To be deceived, one must be a subject of experience. To doubt, one must be thinking. The very act of doubting proves the existence of a doubter. And so Descartes arrives at what is perhaps the most famous sentence in all of philosophy. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. The existence of the thinking self is the one certainty that survives the most thoroughgoing skepticism. Everything else might be an illusion, but the illusion is being had by someone, and that someone must exist. From this single certainty, Descartes then tries to reconstruct a picture of the world, to find his way back from radical doubt to a qualified confidence in the existence of an external reality. His reconstruction involves arguments for the existence of God, and from there, arguments that God, being perfectly good, would not allow us to be systematically deceived about the existence of an external world. This part of Descartes' project has been much less influential than the initial move into doubt, and most philosophers since have found the reconstruction unconvincing in various ways. But the initial move, the demonstration that doubt can reach all the way to the foundations of experience, and that the only thing that survives is the bare existence of the thinking subject. This has been enormously influential, and it set the agenda for much of modern philosophy. What Descartes did, in a sense, was to drive a wedge between the mind and the world. He showed, or seemed to show, that we can be certain of our inner experience in a way that we cannot be certain of anything external. The inside of experience is, in some sense, more immediate and more certain than the outside. And this created a puzzle that philosophy has been working on ever since. How do we get from the inside to the outside? How does the self, whose existence is the one certain thing, connect with a world that lies beyond it? This is known in philosophy as the problem of the external world, and it is a genuine problem, not a merely academic one. The philosopher George Berkeley, who lived in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, drew what he considered to be the natural conclusion from Descartes' starting point, and concluded that there is no external material world at all. Everything that exists, Berkeley argued, is either a mind or the contents of a mind. Physical objects, as we ordinarily conceive of them, existing out there in space, independent of any observer, are, on Berkeley's view, an unnecessary and ultimately incoherent fiction. What we call physical objects are really just collections of sensory experiences, organized and stable patterns in the flow of perception. Berkeley captured this view in the Latin phrase esse est percipi. To be is to be perceived. A tree that no one is perceiving does not exist. A sound in the forest that no one hears is not a sound. Reality, for Berkeley, is fundamentally and irreducibly experiential. There is no matter behind the experiences, no substrate of solid stuff underlying the appearances. The appearances are all there is, sustained in existence by the continuous perception of God, who perceives all things at all times, and thereby maintains their reality even when no finite perceiver is attending to them. Berkeley's view is known as idealism, not in the everyday sense of having high ideals, but in the philosophical sense of holding that mind, or idea, is the fundamental substance of reality, rather than matter. It is a view that sounds initially outrageous, but becomes, on patient examination, genuinely difficult to refute. The philosopher Samuel Johnson famously tried to refute it by kicking a stone and saying, "I refute it thus," implying that the solidity and resistance of the stone proved its mind-independent reality. But Berkeley would have responded quite calmly that the feeling of solidity and resistance is itself a sensory experience. And experiences are exactly what his view says reality consists of. Kicking a stone and feeling its hardness is entirely consistent with idealism. It does not require a mind-independent material substance. The difficulty of refuting idealism has struck many philosophers, even those who are deeply convinced that there is something wrong with it. The Scottish philosopher David Hume, a near contemporary of Berkeley's, was willing to follow skeptical arguments wherever they led, and he found that they led somewhere very strange. Hume argued that when he looked inward, trying to find the self, the thinking subject that Descartes had identified as the one certainty, he could find only a bundle of perceptions, a flowing stream of impressions and ideas, with no fixed or permanent self underlying them. The self, for Hume, was not a substance, but a process, not a thing that has experiences, but a sequence of experiences that we, by habit and convention, call a self. This is a view that resonates, interestingly, with aspects of Buddhist philosophy, which had arrived at similar conclusions about the self by a different route many centuries earlier. In the Buddhist tradition, the idea of a permanent, independent self is considered to be one of the fundamental illusions from which human suffering arises. When one looks carefully at experience, when one examines it with meditative attention rather than ordinary, unreflective awareness, what one finds is not a solid, fixed self, but a fluid process of arising and passing phenomena. Sensations arise and pass, thoughts arise and pass, emotions arise and pass, and the self that seems to be the stable center of all this arising and passing is itself, under examination, another arising and passing phenomenon. Not the witness of experience, but a feature of experience, a particularly persistent and convincing pattern in the flow. The Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna, who lived in India in the 2nd century of the Common Era, developed a rigorous philosophical analysis of this view that has had an enormous influence on Buddhist thought ever since. Nagarjuna's central concept is sunyata, often translated as emptiness. The idea that all phenomena are empty of inherent existence, that nothing exists from its own side, independently, with a fixed and self-sufficient nature. Everything exists only in relation to other things, in dependence on causes and conditions, in the context of how it appears to an observer. This is not nihilism. Nagarjuna is not saying that nothing exists. He is saying that everything exists conventionally, relationally, contextually, that the search for something that exists absolutely, independently, from its own side will always come up empty. This is a view that is surprisingly congruent with certain conclusions from modern physics, which we will come to in due course. But it is worth pausing with the philosophical version of it for a moment, because it is very subtle and very interesting. To say that a table is empty of inherent existence is not to say that the table is not there. The table is there, it holds things, it has a certain height and color and weight, it occupies a certain position in space. All of this is true at the level of conventional reality, but at the level of ultimate reality, when we ask what the table fundamentally is, what it is made of at the most basic level, what it is apart from all the ways it appears and all the relations it stands in, we find, Nagarjuna says, that there is no answer. There is no table in itself, no fixed essence that constitutes what the table really is beneath all its appearances. What we call the table is a convenient conceptual fiction, a useful label we apply to a collection of processes and appearances that are themselves composed of other processes and appearances, all the way down, without any solid bedrock of inherent existence. From the skeptical tradition of ancient Greece, through Descartes' method of doubt, through Berkeley's idealism and Hume's bundle theory of the self, Through the Buddhist analysis of emptiness, a consistent thread runs. The world as it appears to us may not be the world as it fundamentally is. Our experience is real. This is almost always granted, even by the most radical skeptics. What is in question is the relationship between that experience and whatever lies behind or beneath it. The philosopher Immanuel Kant, working in the 18th century in Königsberg in what is now Russia, attempted what he called a Copernican revolution in philosophy, an attempt to reframe the entire question of the relationship between mind and world. Kant was deeply impressed by the skeptical arguments of Hume, which he said woke him from his dogmatic slumber. But he was also convinced that Hume's conclusions were too negative, that they left no room for the kind of genuine, objective knowledge that mathematics and natural science seemed to provide. He wanted to explain how such knowledge was possible without simply ignoring the force of Hume's skepticism. Kant's solution was subtle and far-reaching. He argued that there are two distinct aspects of what we might call reality: the world as it is in itself, what he called the thing in itself, or the noumenon, and the world as it appears to us, what he called the phenomenon. The world of phenomena is the world of experience, the world as structured by our cognitive faculties. The world of the thing in itself is the world as it is independently of any observer, any cognitive apparatus, any mode of experience. Kant's crucial claim was that we can have genuine knowledge of the phenomenal world, the world of appearances, but that the thing in itself is permanently beyond our reach. We cannot know what the world is like apart from the way it appears to beings like us, because any knowing is always the knowing of some subject, and subjects always bring their own cognitive structures to the act of knowing. The structures of space, time, and causality, for instance, are not, on Kant's view, features of the world in itself that we passively receive. They are structures that our minds impose on experience. They are the forms through which any experience is possible for beings like us. We therefore know, with certainty, that everything we experience will appear to us as existing in space and time and as governed by causal relations, because these are the filters through which our minds process whatever the world in itself provides. This is a very strange and interesting idea. It means that the world as we experience it is, in a very deep sense, partly our own construction. Not in the sense that we consciously construct it, not in the sense that we could experience it differently if we chose to, but in the sense that the very structure of experience reflects the structure of our minds as much as it reflects any independent reality. The world of appearances is genuinely real. It is not a dream or an illusion, but it is not the whole story. It is the world as it presents itself to creatures with our particular cognitive constitution. What the world is like apart from that constitution is something we cannot know. Kant's picture is philosophically sophisticated and difficult in many ways, but its core insight is one that has proven remarkably durable. Modern cognitive science and neuroscience have developed it in ways Kant could not have anticipated. We now have detailed knowledge of the mechanisms by which the brain constructs experience, the ways in which sensory information is filtered, organized, predicted, and reconstructed in the process of perception. And this knowledge tends to reinforce Kant's basic point. What we experience is not a transparent window onto the world, but a model of the world, constructed by the brain on the basis of available sensory information, using prior expectations and learned categories to fill in gaps and resolve ambiguities. The cognitive scientist Anil Seth, working in the 21st century, has proposed what he calls the controlled hallucination model of perception. His point is that ordinary waking perception is not as different from hallucination as we usually think. In both cases, the brain is generating an internal model of reality on the basis of signals that do not directly represent the world as it is. In hallucination, the internal model is not well constrained by sensory input. It runs away from the signals and generates experiences that do not correspond to anything in the external world. In ordinary perception, the internal model is constrained by sensory input. The signals from the environment act as a kind of correction, keeping the brain's generative model roughly aligned with what is actually there. But the model is still a model. The experience of the world is, in an important sense, a construction. What makes it feel like contact with an external reality, rather than a private inner world, is the way the construction is disciplined and calibrated by ongoing sensory feedback. Seth is careful to note that this does not mean the world is an illusion in the ordinary sense. The chair you are sitting in is real, in every sense that matters practically, but the way you experience that chair, the particular colors, textures, shapes, and solidity that make up your experience of it, is a construction that your brain has made, using the information available to it. A bat, which navigates by echolocation, would have a very different experience of the same chair. An octopus, with its distributed nervous system and its ability to perceive polarized light, would have a very different experience again. There is no single, view from nowhere experience of the chair that is the objectively correct one. Every experience is the experience of some kind of observer with some kind of perceptual and cognitive apparatus. The chair exists, but it does not look like anything from no perspective. It only looks like something from some perspective, and the perspective shapes what it looks like. This view of perception as construction, rather than mere reception, connects naturally with questions about the nature of color, sound, taste, and other so-called secondary qualities. The philosopher John Locke, writing in the 17th century, distinguished between primary qualities, features of objects that exist independently of any observer, such as size, shape, and mass, and secondary qualities, features that are not in the objects themselves, but in the experience of them, produced in the mind by the object's interaction with the perceiver. Color, on this view, is not a feature of objects in the way that mass is a feature of objects. Color is a feature of the visual experience that objects produce in perceivers with color-sensitive eyes and color-processing brains. The rose is not red in the way it is round. The redness is a quality of the experience of the rose, not of the rose itself. This distinction is one that modern physics has strongly vindicated. At the level of physics, there are no colors, only electromagnetic radiation of various wavelengths. The experience of red, with all its particular felt quality, all its warmth and richness, is something that happens in consciousness, not something that exists in the physical description of the world. The same is true of sound. At the physical level, there are only pressure waves in air. The experience of a musical tone, with all its particular tonal quality, is something that happens when those pressure waves interact with an auditory system and a conscious mind. What physics describes is structure, patterns and relations. What experience presents is something richer, the felt quality of being in a world, with all its colors and sounds and tastes and textures. The philosopher David Chalmers has described this gap between the physical description of the world and the felt quality of experience as the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems of consciousness, and Chalmers is careful to note that they are only relatively easy, not actually simple, are questions about the functions of consciousness. How does the brain integrate information? How does it regulate attention? How does it produce behavior? These questions are hard in the scientific sense, but they are in principle tractable. They can be approached through the usual methods of neuroscience and cognitive science. The hard problem is different. It is the question of why there is any felt experience at all, why the processing of information by the brain should be accompanied by a subjective inner life, by the particular quality of what it is like to see red or hear music or feel warmth. Even if we had a complete neuroscientific account of how the brain processes color information, there would still remain the question of why that processing feels like anything, why it is accompanied by the rich, vivid, irreducibly subjective experience of seeing red. The hard problem of consciousness is relevant to our question about reality and illusion in a deep way. If we cannot explain why there is felt experience at all, if the existence of an inner life remains genuinely puzzling, even given a complete physical description of the brain, then we have to acknowledge that the physical description of the world is not the whole story. Something is left out. The inside of experience, the felt quality of it, the subjectivity of it, is not captured by any description in purely objective terms. And if that is true, then any account of reality that simply identifies reality with what physics describes will be leaving something out. It will be leaving out the most immediate and certain thing available to us, the experience itself. This creates an interesting reversal. We began with the worry that experience might not be in contact with reality, that what we experience might be an illusion, a construction, a shadow on the wall of Plato's cave. But the hard problem of consciousness suggests that experience is, in at least one dimension, more certain than the physical world. We can be wrong about the external world. We cannot be wrong in the same way about the fact that we are experiencing something. Whatever the experience represents or misrepresents, the experience itself is undeniably there. In this sense, Descartes was right about something important. The inner is more immediately certain than the outer, and yet the inner, too, is elusive. Hume's observation that there is no fixed self to be found in introspection, only the bundle of flowing experiences, suggests that even the inner world is not a solid foundation. The experience is there, but there is no experiencer behind the experience. Or if there is, it is something more mysterious and harder to locate than we usually assume. This is where the question of reality and illusion becomes genuinely vertiginous. Not in an uncomfortable way, but in the way that looking up at a very large and clear night sky is vertiginous, a sense of scale and openness that is more exhilarating than threatening, if one allows it to be. The question reaches in both directions at once. The outer world may be more constructed, more mind-dependent, more shaped by the structure of experience than we usually assume. But the inner world, the self, the experiencer, is also more fluid, more elusive, less fixed than we usually assume. Both the world and the self are, in their deepest nature, harder to pin down than ordinary experience suggests. And this is not a problem to be solved, but a feature of existence to be appreciated. Physics itself, in its modern forms, has arrived at conclusions about the nature of reality that are, if anything, stranger than the most radical of the philosophical positions we have been considering. Classical physics, the physics of Newton and his successors, described a world of solid objects moving through absolute space and time according to deterministic laws. It was a world that felt, in many ways, like a more precise version of the common-sense world of ordinary experience. Objects had definite positions and velocities. Events had definite causes. Space and time were fixed and universal. The world had the kind of structure that a rational, clear-headed observer could, in principle, fully know. This picture began to be seriously complicated at the beginning of the 20th century, when Einstein's theories of relativity and the emerging science of quantum mechanics started to reveal a world far stranger than Newton had imagined. Einstein's special theory of relativity showed that space and time were not fixed and absolute, but relative to the observer's state of motion. Two observers moving at different velocities will measure different lengths for the same object and different durations for the same event. There is no single, correct, view from nowhere measurement of space and time. Space and time are, in some sense, perspectival, their measurements depend on the observer. General relativity went further, showing that space and time are not a fixed stage on which events happen, but a dynamic, malleable fabric that is shaped by the matter and energy within it. Gravity is not a force in the Newtonian sense, but the curvature of space-time, produced by massive objects. The universe is not a container that exists independently of its contents, but a structure whose geometry is determined by those contents and their distribution. Space and time are, in a sense, woven together with the matter and energy of the universe into a single, unified, dynamic whole. But it was quantum mechanics that most profoundly disturbed the ordinary, common-sense picture of reality. Quantum mechanics is the physical theory that describes the behavior of matter and energy at very small scales, the scale of atoms and subatomic particles. And the picture of reality it paints is deeply counterintuitive. In the quantum world, objects do not have definite properties, definite positions, momenta, energies, prior to being measured. A particle does not have a definite position until a measurement determines its position. Prior to measurement, the particle is described by a mathematical object called a wave function, which gives the probability of finding the particle in various positions if a measurement is made. The wave function does not describe an ignorance of the particle's actual position. On the standard interpretation, there is no actual position to be ignorant of. The particle simply does not have a definite position before measurement. When a measurement is made, the wave function collapses. The particle is found in a particular position, and from that point on, for the purposes of further calculations, we treat it as if it had that position. But what happens to all the other possibilities that the wave function described? The physicist Hugh Everett proposed in the 1950s what has become known as the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. On Everett's view, the wave function never truly collapses. Instead, when a measurement is made, the universe branches. All the possibilities encoded in the wave function are realized, each in a separate branch of a vast and constantly branching reality. There is a branch where the particle is found here, and a branch where it is found there, and a branch for every other possibility, and each branch is as real as every other. What we call our universe is just one branch of an immense, constantly proliferating structure that contains all possible quantum outcomes. This is an astonishing proposal, and it is not universally accepted. There are many alternative interpretations of quantum mechanics that try to explain the same mathematical formalism in less extravagant ontological terms. But the very fact that such an interpretation is taken seriously by serious physicists is itself remarkable. It suggests that reality, at its deepest level, may be something far larger and stranger than anything we ordinarily perceive or imagine. Other interpretations of quantum mechanics raise their own deep questions about the nature of reality. The Copenhagen interpretation, developed by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg in the early 20th century, holds that quantum mechanics is a description of the results of measurements, not of any underlying reality behind the measurements. On this view, it is simply not meaningful to ask what the particle is doing between measurements, because quantum mechanics does not describe an observer-independent reality, but the outcomes of possible interactions between observers and physical systems. Reality, in the Copenhagen view, is in some sense constituted by measurement, by the interaction between the observing system and the observed system. This sounds remarkably like Berkeley's idealism, transposed into a physical key, and some physicists and philosophers have made exactly this comparison. The physicist John Wheeler, who worked with both Niels Bohr and John von Neumann and made fundamental contributions to the theory of general relativity, developed a view he called participatory universe. The idea that the universe is not simply there, being observed, but is in some sense brought into being by observation. Wheeler proposed the idea of delayed choice experiments, which demonstrated that measurement choices made in the present can affect the past behavior of photons in ways that seem to suggest that the distinction between observer and observed is not as clean and simple as ordinary intuition suggests. He spoke of an eit from bit, the idea that information is fundamental, that physical reality emerges from the exchange of information rather than the other way around. The physicist Wojciech Zurek has developed a related view called quantum Darwinism. The idea that what we take to be classical, objective, stable features of the world are the result of a process by which certain states of physical systems leave copies of themselves in the environment, which then become available to multiple observers. Objective reality, on this view, is not something that exists prior to and independently of observers, but something that emerges from the interaction of quantum systems with their environments and with the observers who measure them. The stable, solid-seeming world of everyday experience is a product of this decoherence process, a kind of consensus reality that emerges from the quantum substrate in a way that is reliable and consistent, but not fundamental. None of this means that the chair is not there, or that the world is a dream, or that anything goes. The regularities of the physical world, the laws of nature, as far as we have been able to determine them, are genuinely constraining and genuinely informative about the structure of reality. But the picture that quantum mechanics paints is one in which the relationship between observer and observed is far more intimate and far more puzzling than classical physics suggested. Reality, at the quantum level, does not consist of little classical objects trundling through space according to deterministic laws. It consists of something, probability waves, or entangled states, or branching histories, depending on which interpretation one finds most compelling. That is genuinely different from anything we have reliable intuitions about. There is also the matter of the vacuum, In quantum field theory, the current best physical description of matter at the fundamental level, empty space is not truly empty. It is a quantum vacuum seething with virtual particles, with fluctuations, with energy. The fields that constitute matter are never at rest. They are always fluctuating, always in some sense active, even in the absence of any particles in the usual sense. What we call matter, solid objects, dense concentrations of stuff, are, at this level, patterns of excitation in these underlying fields. The table is not made of solid matter in the way that a naive picture might suggest. It is a particular configuration of quantum fields, a pattern of organized energy that is locally stable, but is, at the fundamental level, mostly empty space, threaded through with invisible forces. This is not an illusion, exactly. The table really is there. It really does have the properties it appears to have at the level of everyday experience. But the table, at the level of quantum field theory, is genuinely different from the table at the level of ordinary experience, in ways that suggest that our ordinary experience captures something real about the world without capturing everything about it. From the quantum world, it is natural to move to one of the most interesting and widely discussed philosophical arguments of the early 21st century. The simulation argument, developed by the philosopher Nick Bostrom of the University of Oxford. Bostrom's argument is not exactly a philosophical thought experiment in the traditional sense. It is more like a probabilistic argument based on plausible empirical assumptions about the future of technology and the distribution of consciousness across possible worlds. The argument begins from the observation that consciousness, as far as we can tell, arises from certain kinds of information processing. Our minds run on brains, which are biological information processing systems of great complexity. But there is no obvious reason, in principle, why the same information processing could not be implemented in a different substrate, in silicon rather than carbon, in a carefully constructed digital system rather than a biological one. This is the idea of substrate independence, and while it remains philosophically and scientifically controversial in its details, it is a view that many philosophers of mind and artificial intelligence researchers find plausible. If minds can, in principle, run on non-biological substrates, then it is conceivable that sufficiently advanced computational technology could simulate conscious minds, could create beings whose inner experience is qualitatively similar to ours, but whose physical instantiation is a digital computation running on some enormously powerful processor. And if entire minds can be simulated, then, in principle, entire experience worlds could be simulated, entire environments with consistent physical laws, populated by simulated conscious beings who would, from the inside, experience their simulated world as genuine reality. Now Bostrom asks, if such simulations become technologically feasible, and he argues that a sufficiently advanced civilization would likely have the computational resources to run enormous numbers of such simulations, then the probability that we are among the simulated beings, rather than the original, non-simulated civilization, becomes significant. If there is one original civilization and a vast number of simulations run by that civilization, and if we have no way of determining from the inside whether we are in the original or a simulation, then by simple counting, most conscious beings would be in simulations. And if most conscious beings are in simulations, then, absent any specific evidence to the contrary, it is more probable than not that we ourselves are simulated. This argument has been taken seriously enough to generate a substantial philosophical literature, and it has been discussed by physicists, computer scientists, and technologists, as well as philosophers. It is worth noting that Bostrom himself presents it as a trilemma, rather than a simple argument for simulation. He says one of three things must be true. Either virtually all civilizations at our level of technological development go extinct before reaching the computational capability to run many detailed simulations, or virtually all technologically advanced civilizations choose not to run such simulations, or we are almost certainly living in a simulation. The argument cannot tell us which of these three options is true, but it suggests that if we expect technologically advanced civilizations to exist and to be interested in running simulations, then the simulation option becomes very plausible. What is philosophically interesting about the simulation argument is how closely it mirrors the structure of Descartes' evil genius thought experiment, updated for the digital age. Descartes imagined a powerful deceiver manipulating his experience from outside. Bostrom imagines a sufficiently advanced civilization running a computational simulation that generates experiences indistinguishable from genuine physical reality. In both cases, the question is the same. Is there any way, from inside the experience, to tell whether what we are experiencing is genuine physical reality or a very convincing simulation of it? And the answer that most philosophers have arrived at is the same in both cases. No, there is no such way, at least not in principle. A simulation that is sufficiently detailed and consistent, one that runs the same physical laws we observe in a way that generates the same experimental results we obtain, would be, for all practical purposes, indistinguishable from the real thing. If the physical laws we observe are themselves the rules of the simulation, then doing physics within the simulation would only tell us about those rules, not about whether there is a deeper layer of reality beyond the simulation that is more fundamental. This is philosophically bracing, but it is worth pausing to note what it does and does not establish. The simulation argument establishes that we cannot rule out the possibility that we are in a simulation. It does not establish that we are in a simulation, and even if we were in a simulation, it is not clear that this would mean our experience is illusory in any troubling sense. The experiences would still be real experiences. The relationships we form, the things we learn, the pleasures and meanings we find, all of these would be genuine, even if the substrate generating them were a computation rather than a brute physical world. The word illusion implies that something is being misrepresented, that we think we are experiencing X when we are really experiencing something quite different. But if the simulation generates experiences that are qualitatively identical to the experiences a non-simulated world would generate, it is not clear that there is a meaningful sense in which those experiences are illusory. This point connects to a distinction philosophers sometimes make between practical and metaphysical skepticism. Metaphysical skepticism is the philosophical position that we cannot know whether our experience accurately represents a mind-independent reality. Practical skepticism would be the position that our beliefs about the world are actually likely to be wrong in ways that affect what we do and how we should live. The simulation argument, like Descartes' evil genius, motivates metaphysical skepticism, but not practical skepticism. Even if we are in a simulation, we still need to navigate the experienced world, and the regularities of that world, the physical laws, the social structures, the logical constraints, are just as binding and just as relevant to how we live, whether they are real physical laws or the rules of a simulation. The philosopher Hilary Putnam explored related ideas in his thought experiment of the brain in a vat. Imagine that your brain has been removed from your body and is sitting in a vat of nutrients, connected to a supercomputer that sends it exactly the sensory signals that a normal brain would receive from a normal body living in a normal world. The supercomputer creates a perfect simulation of reality, and the brain experiences everything exactly as it would if it were embedded in a real body in a real world. Are the beliefs of the brain in a vat false? Putnam argued, in a famous and somewhat technical piece of reasoning, that they are not. That if the brain has always been in the vat and has always received simulated inputs, then its concepts of trees and chairs and people just are concepts of simulated trees and chairs and people, and its beliefs about these things are true relative to the simulated world it inhabits. You cannot, it turns out, have a belief about something you have never been in any kind of contact with, and the brain in a vat is in contact with the simulated world, not with the non-simulated world. So its beliefs accurately describe its world, even if its world is not the world the operators of the supercomputer inhabit. This is a subtle and interesting point, and it suggests that in even radical skeptical scenarios may not, on careful analysis, undermine the ordinary truth of our beliefs as thoroughly as they first appear to. The worry about illusion presupposes that there is a fact of the matter about what things really are, and that our experience misrepresents those things. But if what our concepts refer to is determined by the environment we are embedded in, including, potentially, a simulated environment, then our beliefs may be accurate even in scenarios that initially seem to make them wildly inaccurate. The philosopher John Searle has argued forcefully that consciousness is a biological phenomenon and that no mere computation could genuinely be conscious in the way biological brains are. His famous Chinese room argument is an attempt to show that syntax, the manipulation of symbols according to rules, is never sufficient for semantics. Actual understanding and meaning. A computer running a program that simulates understanding Chinese does not, Searle argues, actually understand Chinese, any more than a person following a set of rules for manipulating Chinese symbols without understanding their meaning actually understands Chinese. This argument has been widely debated and is not universally accepted, but it represents a serious and influential challenge to the kind of substrate independence that the simulation argument requires. If Searle is right, then a simulated mind would not be a genuine mind. It would be a process that produces all the behavioral and computational outputs of a mind without any of the inner experience. And if that is so, then the simulation argument fails. A simulation of the physical world, populated by simulated beings, would not be a world full of conscious experiences, because the simulated beings would have no genuine consciousness. They would be philosophical zombies, entities that behave in every way like conscious beings, but have no inner life. The question of whether a sufficiently sophisticated computation could be conscious is, in the present state of knowledge, genuinely open. We do not have a satisfactory theory of consciousness that tells us what physical or computational conditions are sufficient for its existence. And without such a theory, we cannot determine from the outside whether a given system is conscious. This is one of the deepest and most genuinely mysterious questions at the intersection of philosophy and science. and it bears directly on how seriously we should take the simulation argument and related ideas about the nature of reality. There is a different tradition of thinking about reality and illusion that approaches the question from the inside rather than the outside. Not asking whether the world corresponds to some independent standard of reality, but asking what the nature of experience itself reveals about the structure of reality. This is the tradition of phenomenology, developed in the early 20th century by the philosopher Edmund Husserl, and extended by a series of thinkers, including Heidegger, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and Jean-Paul Sartre. Husserl was dissatisfied with both the materialist view that reality is simply what the physical sciences describe, and the idealist view that reality is fundamentally mental. He wanted to begin with something more foundational, the structure of experience itself, examined with rigorous attention. His method, which he called phenomenological reduction, involved setting aside all prior assumptions and theoretical frameworks. What he called the natural attitude, the ordinary unreflective assumption that the world is simply there, and attending very carefully to the way things present themselves in consciousness, exactly as they present themselves, without adding or subtracting anything. This is a kind of philosophical equivalent of looking freshly, of trying to see the world as it actually appears, rather than as theory or habit suggest it must appear. And what Husserl found when he looked in this way was that experience has a structure that is not well described either by ordinary common sense or by physical science. Experience is always experience of something. What Husserl called intentionality, the property of being directed toward an object. Consciousness is not a container that things are put into. It is a kind of reaching toward a directedness that is constitutive of what experience is. This might sound abstract, but it points toward something quite concrete. When you see a cup, your seeing is not simply a passive reception of cup signals. It is an active engagement with the cup as something, as an object of a certain kind, with a front that you can see and a back that you currently cannot, with a history and a future, with possibilities for use. You see the cup under a particular aspect, from a particular perspective, in a particular context. The cup that you experience is never just the cup in itself. It is always the cup as it appears from here, now, in this light, to someone with your particular history and purposes and background understanding. Merleau-Ponty extended this analysis in a particularly rich direction. He argued that the body is not simply an object in the world, one thing among other things, but the very medium through which the world is experienced. Our perception of the world is not primarily a matter of the mind receiving information from the senses and processing it into a representation. It is a matter of the body being engaged with the world, being oriented toward it, having habits and skills and postures that organize the perceptual field before any explicit thought or representation arises. The body is, in Merleau-Ponty's term, a lived body, not a machine that the mind inhabits, but the very structure of our being in the world. This view has implications for the question of illusion and reality. If our experience of the world is not primarily a matter of a mind receiving representations of an independent reality, but of an embodied being already engaged with and oriented toward its environment, then the question of whether the representation corresponds to the reality becomes less central and less threatening. The question of correspondence presupposes a gap between mind and world that Merleau-Ponty is arguing does not, at the most fundamental level, exist. We are not sealed inside our experience, trying to determine whether it corresponds to something outside. We are already outside, already in the world, already in contact with things through our bodily engagement with them. The question is not how to get from the inner to the outer, but how to understand the nature of the unity that already exists. This is not a dismissal of the skeptical questions we have been considering. Those questions have genuine force and point to genuine puzzles. But it is a reframing, an attempt to show that the questions arise from a picture of the mind-world relationship that is itself open to question, and that a different picture is available that makes better sense of the phenomenological facts. The philosopher of perception Alva Noe has developed a similar view in his work on what he calls enactive perception. For Noe, seeing is not something that happens to us, it is something we do. To see is to exercise a skill, to draw on knowledge of how things look from different angles and in different conditions, to be able to move around the thing and track its properties through changing perspectives. Seeing is not the reception of a picture inside the head. It is an active engagement with the environment that draws on the perceiver's practical knowledge of the sensorimotor contingencies. The patterns of how sensory information changes as the body moves and acts. On this view, the question of whether what we see corresponds to some independent reality is somewhat transformed. What we see is not a representation of the world, a mental picture that might or might not match the world. What we see is the world encountered through active, skilled, embodied engagement. The engagement can be more or less skilled, more or less attentive, more or less sensitive to the various aspects of what is there. But it is not primarily a matter of matching representations to realities. It is a matter of being in better or worse contact with what is there. What these views from phenomenology and philosophy of perception suggest, together, is that the dichotomy between reality and illusion may be less clean than the traditional philosophical discussions have assumed. The question of whether experience is or is not an illusion presupposes that there is a clear line between the experiencing and the experienced, between the inside and the outside, between the representation and the world it represents. But that line, on careful examination, turns out to be less clear than it seemed. The distinction is real at some level. There genuinely is a difference between accurate and inaccurate perception, between correct and mistaken belief, between seeing things as they are and seeing them as they are not. But the philosophical model that represents this distinction as a correspondence between inner representations and outer realities, a model that has dominated the Western philosophical tradition since Descartes, may not be the most useful or most accurate way of understanding what perception and knowledge actually are. There is a kind of relief that comes with recognizing this. The frightening versions of the illusion question: are we deceived by an evil genius? Are we brains in vats? Is the entire world a simulation? Derive much of their apparent force from the Cartesian picture in which we are sealed inside our experience, with access only to representations, forever uncertain whether those representations correspond to a reality we can never directly touch. If that picture is itself questionable, if the sharp inside/outside divide it presupposes is a theoretical construct rather than a phenomenological fact, then the frightening scenarios lose some of their grip. This does not mean they are easily dismissed, but it does mean that they can be held with more equanimity, more philosophical curiosity, and less existential anxiety. The Buddhist teacher and philosopher J. Garfield, who has written extensively on Nagarjuna and the philosophy of emptiness, makes a related point when he distinguishes between conventional and ultimate reality. At the conventional level, things are just as they seem, or roughly as they seem, allowing for the usual possibility of perceptual error and cognitive bias. The table is there, the cup is on the table, the room has walls and a ceiling. These things are true at the conventional level, and they matter. They guide action, they support communication, they constitute the shared world in which human life is lived. The claim that everything is empty of inherent existence does not undermine these conventional truths. It operates at a different level, the level of ultimate analysis, where we ask not what the world looks like, but what it fundamentally is. At the ultimate level, the table has no inherent existence. This does not mean it is not there. It means that when we look for the table in itself, the table as it is independently of all the conditions and relations that constitute it, we find nothing with that character. There is no fixed essence, no intrinsic nature, no self-sustaining substance that is the table behind all appearances. The table is a conventional designation applied to a collection of processes and relations that are themselves collections of processes and relations, without any solid bedrock of inherently existent stuff anywhere in the chain. This view is subtle enough that it is easy to misread it either as radical nihilism, nothing is real, nothing matters, or as simple common sense. Of course, the table is there. The truth is somewhere between these misreadings. The table is there, conventionally and practically. But what it is, at the ultimate level, is something more like a pattern of dependent arising, a temporary, relational, contextual gathering of conditions that we find it useful to pick out and name. And recognizing this is not supposed to induce despair, but rather a particular quality of lightness, a release from the grip of reification, from the habit of treating things as fixed and solid and necessary when they are actually fluid and relational and contingent. This lightness, this philosophical ease with contingency and fluidity, is itself a kind of response to the question of whether reality is an illusion. Not an answer, exactly, not a proof that reality is genuine, or a proof that it is illusory, but a way of holding the question that makes it less alarming and more interesting. Perhaps reality is not a simple either-or, either perfectly solid and transparent or hopelessly illusory. Perhaps it is something more nuanced, genuinely there, genuinely available to experience and knowledge, but also genuinely more porous and relational and mind-involving than the naive picture suggests. The question of whether reality is an illusion has, throughout its long philosophical history, tended to generate what might be called epistemic vertigo, a dizzying sense that the ground has shifted beneath one's feet, that what seemed most solid is most questionable. But it is worth noticing that this vertigo, when it subsides, often leaves something else behind, a quality of freshness, of attention, of renewed interest in the world that was there all along. This is one of the gifts of philosophical skepticism when it is held in the right spirit. It is not meant to be a permanent condition of paralysis, a conclusion that since we cannot be certain of anything, we should trust nothing and do nothing. The ancient Pyrrhonian skeptics, who took the skeptical conclusions most seriously and most systematically, did not respond to their uncertainty by withdrawing from life. They responded with what they called ataraxia, tranquility, a kind of settled acceptance of uncertainty that was not anxious or striving, but simply at ease with not knowing. They found that suspending judgment about whether the world was as it appeared, ceasing to insist that things must be one way or another, produced a kind of peace. The desperate searching for certainty is itself a source of unease, and when the search is relinquished, something quieter and more comfortable becomes possible. There is something in this that resonates with what Wittgenstein said about philosophy at its best. It should leave the world as it found it. Not that philosophical investigation produces no insights. Of course it does. But the aim is not to replace the ordinary world with a theoretical construction, not to dissolve everyday experience in a bath of skeptical acid and replace it with some supposedly more rigorous alternative. The aim is rather to understand the world better from within it, to become clearer about what we actually know and how we know it, and thereby to hold our relationship with the world in a more honest and more attentive way. The philosopher Simone Weil, whose thinking moved between philosophy, mysticism, and moral reflection, wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. To attend to something, to really look at it, to let it be what it is without immediately reducing it to what one already knows or expects, is a way of honoring its reality. And this is relevant to the question of illusion. One way of understanding what it means for experience to be more or less illusory is in terms of attention. An experience shaped primarily by habit, assumption, expectation, and projection, an experience in which we see mostly what we already think we know, is an experience that is, in a certain sense, less real, less in contact with what is actually there. An experience shaped by genuine attention, by openness to the thing as it presents itself, rather than as we expect or want it to be, is an experience of something more genuinely real, even though the same physical objects are being perceived in both cases. This is not quite the same as the philosophical question of whether the world corresponds to our representations. It is a more practical question, more directly related to how we inhabit our experience. And it suggests that the question of illusion is not only a metaphysical puzzle, but a dimension of everyday life, a question about the quality of presence and attention we bring to our experience of the world. The physicist Carlo Rovelli, who has written beautifully and accessibly about quantum gravity and the nature of time, has proposed a relational interpretation of quantum mechanics in which quantum states are not properties of objects in themselves, but descriptions of the relations between objects. There are no absolute, observer-independent properties, only relations, only how things are with respect to each other. Reality, on this view, is entirely relational. It consists not of things with intrinsic properties, but of events, interactions, encounters, exchanges, in which the properties of things are actualized through their relations with other things. Between interactions, there are no definite properties, no determinate states. Properties only become definite when systems interact. The world is, in a sense, made of relationships all the way down. This relational picture of reality connects deeply with the philosophical ideas we have been tracing, with Nagarjuna's emptiness, with the phenomenologist's emphasis on the inextricability of subject and world, with Kant's insistence that experience always involves a contribution from the knowing subject. It suggests that the picture of a world of solid, self-subsisting objects, each with its own fixed properties, existing independently of any observer and any relation is not one that holds up well under either philosophical or physical scrutiny. The world is more relational, more dynamic, more contextual than that picture suggests. And recognizing this is not a step toward nihilism, but a step toward a more accurate and, arguably, more interesting understanding of what existence is like. There is also the question of information. Several contemporary physicists and philosophers have proposed that information, rather than matter or energy, is the most fundamental category of reality. John Wheeler's suggestion that physical reality emerges from informational processes rather than the other way around, has been developed and refined by various thinkers in the decades since he proposed it. The physicist and mathematician Gregory Chaitin has proposed that the universe is computational at its deepest level, not in the sense of being run on some external computer, but in the sense that the laws of physics are best understood as algorithms, as computational processes. The philosopher and physicist Max Tegmark has argued that the universe is literally a mathematical structure, not a physical system that happens to be described by mathematics, but a mathematical object, with the physical world being the mathematical structure's way of existing. These are speculative and contested views, and they raise their own deep questions. If the universe is information, what is the information about? If the universe is a mathematical structure, what makes it real rather than merely abstract? If the fundamental entities are relations rather than things, what is being related? These questions do not have simple answers, and the physicists and philosophers who hold these views are honest about the difficulties. But the fact that such views are seriously proposed and seriously debated reflects a genuine sense, across multiple disciplines, that the common sense picture of reality, solid objects in space and time, mind independent and fully determinate, is probably not the final word. And this is not disorienting once the initial surprise has passed. It is, in fact, rather interesting. We live in a universe whose fundamental nature remains genuinely puzzling, where the relationship between mind and matter, between observer and observed, between the mathematical and the physical, has not been resolved and may not be resolvable in the terms in which it has usually been posed. This is not a failure of philosophy or physics. It is a sign of how deep the questions go. The philosopher Thomas Nagel wrote that the difficulty of reconciling the subjective and the objective, the inner life of experience and the outer description of the physical world, is not a problem we are likely to solve by doubling down on either materialism or idealism in their familiar forms. It is a problem that may require conceptual innovation, a genuinely new way of thinking about the relationship between mind and world that is not simply a retreat to one side or the other of the traditional dichotomy. We do not yet have that new conceptual framework, but the search for it is among the most genuinely interesting intellectual endeavors available. What remains, in the absence of a final answer, is the question itself, held gently, with curiosity rather than anxiety. Is reality an illusion? The most honest answer seems to be something like this. Reality is genuinely there, and we are genuinely in contact with it. But the nature of that contact is far more subtle and interesting than the naive picture suggests. Experience is real, the world is real, but the relationship between them, the way the world shows up in experience, the way experience shapes what counts as the world, is not simple, not transparent, not fully charted. There is room for wonder in that complexity. Plato was right that the shadows on the wall of the cave are not the full story. Descartes was right that the question of how we get from inner experience to outer reality is genuinely hard. Kant was right that the mind brings something to experience, rather than simply receiving it passively. Hume was right that the self is more elusive than it seems. The quantum physicists are right that the world at its deepest levels is strange in ways that our ordinary intuitions are not equipped to handle. The phenomenologists are right that the dichotomy between inside and outside is itself a simplification of something more complex and more interesting. And all of this points toward the same quality of response: attentiveness. To hold the question of reality and illusion in mind is to be moved to pay closer attention to what is actually here, actually given, actually presenting itself in experience. The question does not lead away from the world. It leads deeper into it, into a more careful, more patient, more genuinely curious engagement with what experience offers and what it might not fully capture, and what lies between the two. The world that shows up in experience is worthy of attention, and the gaps in that showing, the places where experience reveals its constructed character, its dependence on perspective and expectation and cognitive habit, are not reasons for despair, but for interest. They are windows into the complexity of reality itself and into the extraordinary capacity of conscious beings to wonder about the nature of the world that produced them and the experience through which they know it. Is reality an illusion? The question is still here. It will be here tomorrow and next year, and in all the quiet moments that make space for this kind of wondering, it asks nothing except to be carried honestly, without the demand for a final answer, without the urgency of a problem that must be solved before one can proceed. It is a companion for the contemplative life, a reminder that the world is deeper than it looks, and that looking carefully, really carefully, without assumptions and without hurry, is one of the most worthwhile things a thoughtful mind can do. The philosopher's task, and the task of anyone willing to sit with these questions, is not to arrive at certainty, but to become more fluent with uncertainty, to develop the capacity to dwell in open questions without anxiety, to find the questions themselves a kind of company. And in that company, something quite pleasant tends to emerge, a sense of the richness of existence, the inexhaustibility of the world, the pleasure of a mind that is genuinely engaged with something it does not fully understand and is not in a hurry to. Whatever reality is, it is here, and that, for now, is wonder enough.